Welcome to Early Returns, hosted by Jan Baran, a partner of Holtzman Vogel. This podcast examines law and politics and seeks insights from political players in elections, lobbying, media, and the law. Now, let's join our host, Jan Baran.
Welcome back to Early Returns, a podcast about law and politics. I'm your host, Jan Baran. Our producer is Jody Mayer Piazza. Our topic today is artificial intelligence, AI. I've heard about AI, read about it, and noticed it being mentioned in search engines, business articles, social discussions, and professional papers. I personally knew it existed and that I have been subjected to certain AI applications, but I didn't feel up to date or really knowledgeable about the subject. I had a vague sense that someday, if not now, we humans would be controlled by computers and a disembodied voice like Siri on Apple Maps or Hal from the movie Space Odyssey 2001. It's hard to believe that Space Odyssey was released in 1968, and we are now, today, 24 years past what was then the futuristic year of 2001. So I decided we should have an episode about AI and specifically how it will affect the law, lawyering, and perhaps public policy and regulation. I'm lucky to have as my guest a true expert on AI and the law. Oliver Roberts is an adjunct professor of law at Washington University Law School in St. Louis and co-director of the WashU Law and AI Collaborative. He wears many additional hats. He's also co-head of the AI practice group at Holtzman Vogel Law Firm. He's editor-in-chief of the AI and the Law publication at the National Law Review, and he's the founder and CEO of Wickard.ai. His recent teaching includes the course AI and the Practice of Law at WashU Law School. He also teaches the nation's first required AI law school course at Case Western Reserve School of Law. And he's been the first legal AI teacher at Addis Ababa University's School of Law in Ethiopia. Oliver graduated from Harvard Law School and Villanova University undergrad before founding Wickard.ai, which is a training and education startup. Oliver previously founded a technology startup focused on employment solutions. He's also been a busy lawyer. He's argued twice before the Third Circuit Court of Appeals and has secured a certiorari denial, which preserved one of those victories. Oliver's admitted to practice law in New York, Texas, and Washington, D.C. Oliver, welcome to Early Returns, and thanks for being here.
Happy to be here, and thank you so much for having me.
Well, I've given all the vital statistics and information about you, but I didn't say where you grew up. So what's hometown for you?
Yeah, grew up in Massapequa out on Long Island in New York. It's a great place. And been DC, Dallas, New York City, so many different places since then.
Well, you still have some association with your hometown of Massapequa. I understand you're doing some ongoing litigation. What's that all about?
Yeah, so there's a pretty high-profile case going on over in New York right now where the state passed the regulation about 2.5, 3 years ago now, requiring all the schools to eliminate any names, logos, mascots associated with indigenous culture. And out of Massapequa, we're the Massapequa Chiefs. We wear that proudly and respectfully, yet even respectful names, logos, imagery, you have to eradicate under this regulation. So Massapequa's fighting back and I'm on their team. I'm from Massapequa. This one's personal for me. So really proud to be representing my home school district in this lawsuit against New York State.
Well, if you win, I assume that will help preserve the name of the Kansas City Chiefs in the NFL. They seem to get by with that name without any controversy.
Yeah, we'll see what happens.
Yeah, well, good luck on that. And that leads me to ask, from Massapequa and your college and law school, at what point did you begin to study and gain an interest in artificial intelligence? How did that get started in your life?
Yeah, so we'll get into this later in the episode about kind of what AI is versus generative AI. But AI in itself is a very broad category. It's virtually any software product you've used, even used prior to ChatGPT, has AI in it. So my first introduction to all this was building my own SaaS product, software as a service tool. And this was a job platform helping connect people looking for jobs in politics and law. And I actually built this back in 2022. I was an associate at Skadden just for like 8-9 months, and I left to go start a startup. So that was my first entry into building in the SaaS space, AI space.
And what happened to that startup tech company?
I ultimately sold that company after a couple months, went back to practicing law, but that was the entry point. And of course, generative AI, that's the launch of ChatGPT. That became very popular in November 2022. So once generative AI came onto the scene, everyone started shifting and building in that space, and as did I. So I've experienced building these products, and I like to take that hands-on approach.
Well, how would you define generative AI, and how is it different from other technologies or applications that also were called AI? Let's help our audience here with some basic information about AI and its variations.
Yeah, definitely. So AI, artificial intelligence, that's the broadest field. It's a broad field of computer science. Basically, it's a machine that is able to carry out a task that would otherwise require human problem solving or intelligence. It's very broad. It's stuff like self-driving cars, spell check even. So AI is really this very broad term. Generative AI is different than AI. That is a subset, so just a much smaller component of AI, in which you have these AI systems that generate new images, text, videos based on data that they're trained on. So the big differentiator is generative AI is generating something new. That's why it's called Gen AI. So you think ChatGPT, you put in text, it generates text back. You have these image generation tools. You put in text, hey, I want to see a picture of a cat, and it generates that. So that's the big difference. And Gen AI is that subset of the broader category of computer science that is AI.
So generative AI requires the user to enter in a request of some sort on a computer. Is that correct?
Generally, yes. There'll be most of the applications out there. You have to input something to ultimately generate that new output.
And the generation is possible because of the computing power of the service and computer, but also that it's relying on an enormous database. Is that correct?
Yeah, billions, now trillions of data points. It's trained on all this different data, whether it be images, videos from the internet, text from the internet. It's a very complex process in which the inputs pass through neural networks. That's where it interacts with that training data to ultimately produce that new outcome.
Well, in addition to generative AI, you referred to some of the other AI uses and applications, self-driving vehicles and so forth. How is AI entering our daily lives? Let's assume we're not using a computer or asking questions to generate images and answers. What's seeping into our everyday life that reflects artificial intelligence?
Yeah, I mean, most people encounter AI like literally every minute. You just don't realize it. Things like just picking up your phone, going on social media, and you see the thing you like the most or the family, friends you have, their images on Instagram or their posts on Facebook pop up first. That is a form of AI. That algorithm underneath that you don't see is pushing up the most popular content to your feed. That is a form of AI, those algorithms. Other things include just being able to pick up your phone and have Face ID, unlock your phone for you. That's a form of AI. Spam filters and email, that's another form of AI. So all this stuff happens without you even realizing it. And there's many other applications in other areas, but those are some of the most day-to-day obvious ones that you're going to encounter without even realizing it.
Well, one of the things that I use quite regularly is Google search or other search engines. They've relied on algorithms throughout their history, right? So how does AI change or augment the algorithms that they've been relying on to provide their search capabilities? What's different as a result of AI?
Yeah, so AI has been around since the 1950s. Like the first chatbots been around since the 1960s. They're very simplistic where you would be able to type in, hey, how are you? And the chatbot could only respond, good, how are you? So it's very much hard coded. It was very much rules based. The behind the scenes, it would be coded if the user says, hey, you can reply with this list of pre-established responses. So very simplistic. What's different now is the fact that we have generative AI and these neural networks, more specifically transformer architecture, which allows for a lot more variability, a lot more creativity, because it's using now trillions of data points rather than just rules-based coding, which is so much more simplistic. So generative AI, what's really changed the discussion around AI, but still AI has been around, to your point, search engines now for decades, and that does leverage AI.
So the movie I referred to, Space Odyssey, which was produced in 1968, really was quite futuristic. It must have been aware of the birth and use initially of AI technology, but it, in many ways preceded even the existence of large computers. It may have sort of sensed that IBM was really going to change our lives even back in the 1960s. What are the results of AI seeping into law and the practice of law and the teaching of law? You're now teaching law students about artificial intelligence. Why do lawyers need to know about it? And what's going on with AI in the law?
Yeah. So AI is definitely important. It's changing every industry at this point. So it's not just law as this outlier area. To give you some stats on it, a recent poll by, I believe it was law.com, said like 54% of lawyers are now using AI for at least one use case. Clio is a practice management software. They said back in like November of 2024, 79% of lawyers are using AI. So the numbers are really different depending on what poll you're looking at.
So are lawyers using generative AI or other types of AI?
To be honest, no one really knows. Like in all these polls, some of these polls are flawed because they'll call lawyers or give them a survey and say, are you using AI? And if a lawyer doesn't know the definition of AI vis-a-vis Gen AI, how are they going to accurately answer the poll? But then also some of these pollsters are tech companies themselves. So it sounds good if 80+% of lawyers are using AI, they get to report that. And then you have the FOMO effect of lawyers saying, oh, everyone else is doing it, let me do it. So there's really no clear understanding in the market right now, how often AI is being used, how often generative AI is being used. But this is very much something that law schools are committing to. Law firms are buying in, even if they don't need the products, they don't want to be left behind. And a lot of this is also client driven. I've talked to a lot of chief innovation officers who say that the RFPs that they're getting explicitly ask those questions. What tech are you using in representation of clients? So law firms now feel compelled to adopt these technologies, even if they're not efficient, just for the sake of staying ahead with clients and being competitive in the RFP process.
Now, you mentioned Clio. Is that an AI application or is that a publication?
Clio, it's a practice management software. It's been around for a long time. They do have AI in it, and also they have some generative AI components as well.
So they're selling their application to law firms in particular, or is it broader?
Yeah, I believe it's mostly law firms, mostly smaller, mid-sized law firms. And that's just one of many products out there. To the question you asked about how AI is actually practically changing law. I mean, we see it in legal research. You have Lexis plus AI now. It's called Protege. You have Co-Counsel, which is Westlaw's AI offering. And those tools give you the ability to draft. You can just type into a chatbot, draft me a contract, draft me a motion to dismiss, and it'll happen instantaneously. You type in questions now, and instead of just putting it into a search bar on Lexis or Westlaw, you put it into a chatbot, and it then gives you those answers written out with citations. But they have varying degrees of accuracy, and there's still a lot of shortcomings with these AI tools.
Well, I want to talk about that, but before we do, I had one question, which is these AI applications that are being marketed by various tech companies, do you have to pay for that, or is that free?
Yeah, I mean, virtually every tech product out there, legal tech product, you're going to have to pay for it. You might get like a free trial or discounts and stuff, but they're all paid applications for the most part.
So are there any free applications, or is it all paid for?
Right now, the most commonly used AI tool by lawyers is ChatGPT. There were 2 recent polls that came out in March about that, and it's like clear-cut ChatGPT used. I think it's double the next legal tech product. And of course, ChatGPT is not in itself legal specific, but they're a free version of ChatGPT.
And that's a generative AI product, right? Or is it more?
Yeah, ChatGPT is generative AI. Mm-hmm.
Okay. So I'm a lawyer. I'd like to use generative AI. I subscribe to Chat GPT. So what are the upside and downside of using that in practicing law? You mentioned that if I had a brief to prepare, I could initiate some research. Tell me what the law in Tennessee is on standing in the local courts, because I've got a case that requires some advocacy on that topic. Would Chat GPT help me put together an initial brief? That's an upside, I guess. What are then the downsides? But let me give you a chance to articulate, as you see it, what the upsides and downsides are.
Yeah, it's definitely a complicated response to that question, because upsides, speed. If you were just to start writing, let's say, a demand letter or a motion, or just literally writing anything just from a blank piece of paper without any AI assistance, it's going to take you a long time. Whereas if you put that same inquiry into a chatbot, you'll get an answer in literal seconds. So at least it'll act as a starting point, so you don't have a blank page. The other side of the equation is that output. You don't know how accurate it's going to be. If you're using ChatGPT for legal research, more than half the time, the cases are probably going to be hallucinated, completely wrong. So there's always that risk of, yes, you'll get something a lot quicker, but you don't know the accuracy of it if you're relying on ChatGPT to provide citations or factual information. It's a lot better for writing, creativity, but you're still going to have that oversight and editing process. So it really depends on the use case, depends on the lawyer. Is the initial speed a good ROI vis-a-vis the fact you're still going to have to check it all line by line?
So you'd have to check everything that's in the content of generative AI result. Probably, I assume, more than just blue booking to make sure that the cases are cited accurately or even exist. What would the process look like once you've generated all this text as a lawyer and using generative AI? I have pages of text. What do I need to do to make sure that it's valid, that it's worthy of actually submitting to a client or to a court?
So let's say hypothetically you use ChatGPT to draft a motion to dismiss, and you say include some case citations in there. You're going to have to go line by line, checking the accuracy of what's being written. You're going to have to take all the citations, put them into Lexis or Westlaw to double check. The most recent ChatGPT 4.5 version that came out about 2 months ago, they did their own internal benchmarking, and this is all public. 37% of the time, it hallucinates factual information. So over 1/3 of the time, you try to get factual information from ChatGPT, it's going to be totally made up. And they were happy about that result because the prior versions of ChatGPT hallucinated 60+% of the time. So I don't think people understand the high rates of hallucinations when you're trying to get factual information from a chatbot. And of course, citations, that's factual information. That's different than saying ChatGPT hallucinates 37% of the time, because most people aren't using it to ask objective factual questions. They say, give me ideas for this, help me proofread that, write this letter. That's not factual, objective information. So that's the irony of this. ChatGPT, by far the leading use case of AI by lawyers, yet by far going to hallucinate a lot more in the work that lawyers do when they're trying to do legal research through this medium.
So in large law firms, I assume that associate attorneys are generating the research product using AI, and then it's going to be up to them to check factually and otherwise the result before they actually hand it over to a client or a partner. Is that actually a time saving? Is it going to save clients money and the billable time of the associates? Or does it increase the cost and time that associates will use?
Yeah, I mean, it's still an open question, and it'll really depend on the use case. I mean, AI in contract drafting is a lot more stable, accepted, benchmarked than use of AI for legal research. Same for e-discovery. AI has been around in e-discovery dating back to at least 2012 with TAR. So that's a lot more accepted, benchmarked, has a lot of value. You couldn't even imagine today doing a big doc review without uploading your documents into an AI-powered e-discovery platform. So in those use cases, the efficiency and ROI is certainly there. As for legal research, maybe not as much right now, but it really depends. And some of the ways the legal tech companies are improving that efficiency is grounding it. So if you looked at like using one of these AI powered research tools 2 years ago, you would just get the responses. There wouldn't be citations. And what I mean by citations is you'll see this today if you use Lexis or Westlaw, co-counselor protege, you could ask, what is the rule for personal jurisdiction in Texas? And then you'll get a chatbot response and it'll give you the citations. And then you click on the citations and it'll pop up from the side of the screen. And that allows you to then go right to the database and verify that those cases exist. This is a method that legal tech companies are using, grounding it in actual information from their database so that these chatbots hallucinate a lot less.
And is that technology changing and improving on a regular basis? You already mentioned that ChatGPT is now proud that only 37% of their product is inaccurate, and it's way down from 60-some percent. So I have a sense that things are changing very quickly. Is that correct?
Yeah, definitely improvements. We're nowhere near a point where hallucinations will be totally eliminated. I think most people agree that we will never fully eliminate them, but there's different methods that are being used in certain domain applications like law, where they're able to ground it in citations from like a Westlaw database or Lexis database. So that does improve the accuracy rates and brings down the hallucination rates.
Well, if lawyers and law firms are using AI, what about the judges in the courts? Are they starting to use AI? And if so, how is that going?
Yeah, they definitely are. And in ways most people would not expect. There have been judges who actually use ChatGPT, Gemini, Claude. Those are all foundational models to actually help them write opinions. There was a case in February of this year, Ross v. United States in Washington, D.C., where Judge Deal in a dissent actually used ChatGPT to help inform what he thought would be common knowledge. So basically the case was about this woman. She left a dog in a car on a hot day. And the question was, is it common knowledge that if you leave your dog in the car, it'll lead to injury to the dog? And the majority on appeal overturned the trial court saying that, there just wasn't sufficient evidence. Judge Deal in a dissent said, this is obvious. Yes, if you leave a dog in a car, it'll lead to injury. And in fact, I'm going to ask ChatGPT. So he basically regarded ChatGPT as this aggregator of common knowledge, asked the question, and ChatGPT said, yes, it is, of course, common knowledge, yada, yada. So there's an example of a judge actually resorting to ChatGPT as this ability to establish what would be common knowledge among humans. So that's a use case where judges are actually using it to render decisions and help inform decision making.
That potentially would create some ethics problems for judges, particularly if they're using this technology to do some research and independent fact-finding, because at least since the common law was started, judges are supposed to confine their knowledge to the facts and information that is actually introduced in a case and tested between the parties. And I know from having studied judicial ethics that judges really aren't supposed to, for example, just do their own Google research in conjunction with a case. Here you're telling me that that's changing because judges are now starting to say, well, we can take judicial notice of certain facts just by using AI research technology.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, definitely. I mean, of course, judges cannot advocate their independent judgment. I think what a judge would counter with is the fact that this is no different than having to pull up books and dictionaries to go interpret words or interpret common knowledge. But I think it's very much a gray area. And in fact, I think that judges should be required to disclose their use of AI the same way that most lawyers across the country are required to disclose their use of AI if they're filing with the court. I think a court's decision is even more momentous and important. So definitely, I think AI used by a judge in any capacity, whether it's writing or even just preparing anything in a case, should be disclosed to the public because these AI models are known to hallucinate. They are known to have certain biases because they're all trained on text data from the internet. And that usually sways a certain direction. The developers of these tools have also excluded certain publications and certain news sources that they may think are extreme or incompatible with their views. So you're now creating these models, and now judges are using these models as some source of common knowledge. But in reality, it's just common knowledge that reflects what's on the internet and what the developers decide to include or not include, which is very problematic. And that's why I think it should be disclosed to the public. I can see situations in the future where we find out judges used AI to write an opinion, and that may be a basis for reversal. So I think this is going to be a very interesting area developing law.
So if I heard you correctly, if a lawyer uses AI in a pleading, or if a judge uses AI in a ruling or dissent, there are now rules that require disclosure by both the lawyers or the judges that they're actually using AI. Is that a rule of procedure that's being adopted? Is it nationwide here in the U.S.? What are the rules in terms of disclosing the use and dependence on AI?
Yeah, so there's been over 200 standing orders from judges. This is not a change in like the federal rules of civil procedure or anything like that. It's just standing orders from judges. There's been over 200 since the launch of ChatGPT. This started with Judge Brantley Starr. He's in Northern District of Texas. He was the first one to do this back in 2023. But most judges are moving away from this because the reality is these standing orders will say stuff like, you have to write an extra certification that, hey, I used AI and I verify the accuracy of this. But the reality is, as lawyers, we already have to do that on every single pleading. So it's adding this redundancy that doesn't actually help. Because if you're a lawyer who's not doing the duty of editing your own work substantively, adding an extra thing that you drop a signature on is not going to change. So I know the Fifth Circuit, there was petitioning to get the Fifth Circuit to adopt this broad AI certification requirement, signing off that, yes, they used AI and verified the accuracy. They decided not to move forward. And there are no federal appellate courts right now that require this. So it's mostly at the state court level, the federal district level, but a lot of courts are moving away from this requirement.
So that there was this outburst in individual judges or courts requiring certain sort of disclosure or certification, but now that seems to be disappearing. And is that what you expect going forward, that it's just going to be presumed that you use AI and you don't have to certify or let people know that you are using it? Is that the trend, right?
Yeah, definitely. Supreme Court of Illinois came out with a new policy in January, and I think this will probably be an exemplar for other states as well. They said no need to certify that you used AI or not. We already expect you to uphold your responsibilities as lawyers and verify the accuracy of anything you file in our court.
Well, if that's a trend with judges and courts, what about other government entities, Congress or legislatures? Are they starting to regulate AI in substantive ways that we should be aware of?
To some extent. I mean, the current state of play right now of AI regulation at the federal level is that it's basically non-existent. There's no comprehensive federal regulation on AI. I say that with the caveat of two things mostly. One, last week, there was the Take It Down Act. So that was actually passed by Congress and heading to the desk of President Trump. That's expected to actually get signed into law. So that actually criminalizes the use of AI to create like online pornography and more extreme cases. So criminal penalties there, also requirements on certain social media platforms to take it down if they get notified that someone did put this up there. So that's one example of new federal regulation that is most likely to come into effect. And the second caveat is action by federal agencies as well as the presidency. So Biden, back in November 2023, he issued this executive order 14,110, and that put pretty onerous requirements and obligations on developers of the frontier models. So we're talking like the makers of ChatGPT, the makers of Gemini, the makers of Claude. They had to report basically any activity they were doing. So if they're going to release a new model, they were going to do new testing on a model, they had to report that to the US government. If they had large clusters, that is basically GPUs, which is the hardware that is able to train and operate these frontier models. If you had large clusters, you had to report their location, the amount of capability you have to the US government. You also had to do red teaming, which is basically testing your model, having people to try to jailbreak your model before you release it public. So there's a lot of requirements under the Biden executive order. But when Trump came in, he rescinded that day one. 3 days later, Trump issued a new executive order. And in that executive order, he called for the creation of a national AI action plan. And we should expect that by July based on the timeline in that executive order. So that's what's going on right now at the federal level.
Very interesting. I gather that these sort of feints or attempts at regulating or thinking about regulating is driven more by privacy concerns, or is it driven by just general curiosity to have more disclosure about what's going on in the technology? What's driving the thinking that we have to regulate in some way?
Driven by many things. Privacy is one of them. Data usage is another one. Algorithmic discrimination, that's one of the most popular terms. In Virginia, they passed this algorithmic discrimination bill, passed both chambers, but then it was vetoed by Glenn Youngkin. But I think a lot of this, I'm probably one of the biggest critics out there of AI regulation. I've written a lot criticizing the EU AI Act, the Texas AI Governance Act, Responsible AI Governance Act. So I'm very critical because I think a lot of these bills do not actually understand what AI is. One example is this Texas Responsible AI Governance Act. I criticized it because it categorized high-risk AI and then actually used its own terms to define high-risk AI. So there's literally no real definition of high-risk AI, yet these legislators are pushing ahead to regulate something that they do not understand and cannot even define. So I'm very critical of this area.
Well, you mentioned legislation that attempted to address discrimination. What kind of discrimination were they talking about when they passed some of these bills?
Yeah, so a lot of the concerns are that these AI models are, of course, trained on past data. That's how they have this whole repository. They could generate new data based on patterns in these massive data sets. So the concern is these massive data sets are biased because, again, they only represent what's been written about on the internet. One high profile example is Amazon. They had this study when they were using AI to help hire people. It would hire people with certain names reflecting more so people of a certain demographic, disadvantaging people of another demographic, just because they looked at all the people they've hired in the past and then said, these are people who've worked out for us. We're going to create a model that now reads new resumes and picks people like we've hired in the past. So that creates systematic issues with bias. So those are just one example of the concerns of potential algorithmic discrimination.
Well, would that violate existing civil rights laws of any sort?
Yeah, potentially. That's one of the big counter arguments where you have all these legislators pushing ahead. Let's regulate AI. Let's do this. Let's do that. The reality is a lot of these transgressions are already covered by existing criminal statutes, civil statutes. One example is the Federal Election Commission. They were petitioned last summer to pass this new AI-specific regulation to not allow the use of AI to create deceptive advertisements. But it's already covered under FICA that you can't do that very action. And the commission said, whether you're using AI or not, you're still not allowed to do this deceptive activity. It's covered under FICA. So there's this desire to create all these new laws and be responsive to AI's problems, but a lot of them are covered by existing regimes already.
So AI is obviously being used in political campaigns and political advertising, and that's part of the future for AI. What do you think is going to change going forward? Are you prognosticating where all of this is headed?
No one really knows. And if someone says they definitively know, they do not. Some big changes I could see in the coming 2 years are one, possible changes in copyright law. These AI models, these companies that built these AI models are steeped in litigation right now. OpenAI, New York Times is one of the biggest cases right now. And a bad ruling on copyright law, whether this is actually fair use to take all the data from these publishers and use it in your AI model for training, this could ultimately kill a lot of these AI companies. So I can see Congress potentially stepping in saying, hey, we need to codify fair use for data training. Otherwise, our whole AI industry, more specifically the large language models, they're going to be killed. And now we're behind China, we're behind adversarial nations economically, national security ways as well. So I see copyright potentially changing. I could also see federal preemption. This was a hotter topic prior to the Virginia AI bill getting killed, prior to that TRIGA bill. That legislator who introduced TRIGA, he ultimately stripped his entire bill like a month ago. So you saw the writing on the wall, no way is it getting passed. But there was a lot of groundswell for AI bills and a lot of momentum after the first one was passed in Colorado last year. We've still had over 780 AI bills pending right now, which is a huge number. So these AI companies will literally potentially be subject to 50 different regimes across the US, and it's very tough to operate. So OpenAI actually asked the US government already to preempt all these state laws. And I think it may potentially result in preemption down the road again, because all this is now a national security issue, economic issue against China, because China also now has DeepSeek, Manus, and a lot better AI capabilities as well.
Well, all of that information suggests to me, Oliver, that you're probably going to be back on this podcast as time and events develop. But for now, for our listeners, to get more information about AI and the law, other than taking one of your courses, what recommendation do you have for study and reading to our audience?
Yeah. So one podcast I listen to pretty often is the Everyday AI podcast. They're really good on just keeping up to date on everything, regulatory developments in the industry, et cetera. MIT Technology Review, that's another good one. They always have really good in-depth articles on AI. And then TechCrunch, that's more so on the industry side, less so law, but they also cover regulations every once in a while as they relate to the AI industry. So I'd say those are the three top ones that I go to for information.
Well, thank you. And thank you, Oliver Roberts, for helping us understand AI and the law. Thanks also to our producer, Jody Mayer Piazza, and to the Holtzman Vogel Law Firm for its support of this program. Any opinions expressed here are those of the host and our guests and do not necessarily reflect the views of our sponsors or their clients. All of our episodes are available on Buzzsprout, Spotify, Apple, and Google Podcasts. I hope you'll check out some of our past podcast episodes and join us again on the next episode of Early Returns. Have a good day, everyone.
Thanks for joining Early Returns, Law and Politics with Jan Baran. We hope you will join us for future episodes, which will continue to bring you voices and insights from the people engaged in our political landscape.